Alright, so we're starting up now with our fourth section on microevolution in the Raven textbook. And so the next little bit of natural selection that we're going to look at is a phenomenon called oscillating selection. And this is a situation where the selective pressure varies kind of back and forth over time. So oscillating means like moving back and forth, almost like an oscillating fan does, right? Back and forth from starting position to some other position and then back to the starting position and then back and forth like that. So this example here is a really commonly cited example of natural selection that occurred on the Galapagos Islands in a species of finches that was first described by Darwin, actually, but this one's called the medium ground finch. And so this study was initiated back in the mid-70s, and it continued on for, actually still continues on today. It's been going on for quite a while, actually. So what they've noticed in this study is that first off down here, the first picture, first graph, first figure, says that the depth of the parent's beak is positively correlated with the depth of the offspring's beak. So basically all this is saying is that the size of the beak in these medium ground finches is genetic. What the parents had is roughly what the offspring are going to have. Okay. Now, what the top figure is showing us is an increase in beak depth in dry years and a decrease in beak depth in wet years. And so the reason for this is it actually goes back to the cyclical nature of ocean currents and El Nino and La Nina and those kinds of things. And so what happens here is that there is a periodicity of drought in the Galapagos. And so in dry years, plants that produce big, tough seeds do better than plants that produce smaller, more delicate seeds. So if you happen to be a medium ground finch that has a big beak and can get into those big seeds, you're going to do better. You're going to leave behind more offspring. And in the next year, the average beak size is going to be just a little bit bigger than it was the year before. Now, during a wet year, the small-seeded plants, who can make a whole lot more seeds because each seed is smaller, they're going to do better. And so in the wet years, or following the wet years, if you happen to be a small-beaked parent that produced small-beaked offspring, you're going to do better. And so you're going to leave behind more genes, and the average beak size is going to go down in the wet years or following the wet years. So this is actually a really good example of oscillating selection in beak size in these ground finches in response to the environmental conditions around them. Right? Now, another phenomenon, which is a little bit of a special scenario, is something called heterozygote advantage. And so this is a case where, regardless of really what gene you're talking about, if you're homozygous dominant, if you're homozygous recessive, you're not going to be quite as fit as those individuals who are heterozygous. Right? So a really good example of this is with sickle cell anemia. And I'm sure most of you guys know this example. It's become fairly popular as far as sort of illustrating different concepts here in biology. But sickle cell anemia is an autosomal recessive condition. Right? So right off the bat, we know that if you're homozygous dominant, you're perfectly fine. You have no sickle cell disease. But if you're homozygous recessive, you're going to have full-blown sickle cell disease, and that is not something which is very easy to survive, even in the best of cases, with good medical technology and help and those kinds of things. Even with that, somebody is not necessarily likely to survive full-blown sickle cell disease that occurs as a result of being homozygous recessive. But if you're heterozygous, you actually have the ability to survive sickle cell disease, even without a lot of really intensive medical care. You can survive sickle cell if you're heterozygous, and actually get to the point where you can pass on your genes to your offspring. Now, the question then becomes is, well, why is the sickle cell allele in the population at all? If it's so detrimental, if it's so bad, if it's so negative that those individuals that have it either have full-blown sickle cell or at the very least, best case, mild sickle cell, why hasn't that allele gone away? Why is it still in the population? And so it turns out that having the heterozygous condition for sickle cell allows you to survive a different disease called malaria. And malaria is a really big killer of people. It kills something like 500,000 people per year, mostly in sub-Saharan Africa. But if you happen to have one copy of that sickle cell allele, the malaria parasite has a harder time infecting your cells and therefore has a harder time causing disease to the point where it can actually take you out and kill you. So to kind of like summarize this, if you're homozygous dominant, you are sickle cell free, but if you get malaria, there's a really good chance malaria might kill you if you're homozygous dominant. If you're homozygous recessive, you've got full-blown sickle cell disease, and most likely you're going to die as an infant. There's really not much chance of surviving that one in most cases. But if you're heterozygous, you can deal with low-level sickle cell disease relatively easily. You can also survive malaria if you get that. So having one of each allele is kind of like the best case where you are able to survive both diseases in that case. This map, by the way, is one that's kind of interesting that shows the overlap between the range of the sickle cell allele and the incidence of malaria in sub-Saharan Africa. So we see, the places, the cross-hatched areas are places where there's malaria in Africa, the worst kind of malaria in Africa, and the red shaded areas are sort of the incidence of sickle cell alleles in those different parts of Africa. So there's a lot of overlap there between malaria, where malaria is, and where that sickle cell allele shows up. All right, so another situation. The survival of an organism is the result of all of its alleles in combination. Right? So the idea here is that it's not just one allele typically that determines whether an organism survives or not. So the idea here is, okay, well, what happens if you have some really, really good alleles, but you also have some really, really bad alleles? And those bad alleles are so bad, or the effect is so bad, that it actually causes you to have a lower fitness. Even though you had some good alleles, the bad alleles outweighed that, and they took you out maybe before you had a chance to reproduce. Right? So it's the whole package, the entire genotype, that ultimately determines whether or not an organism survives and reproduces. So you can actually lose some beneficial alleles if they're overshadowed by the effect of some more harmful alleles. Now we can also look at different kinds of selection. Right? So we're going to look at different types of natural selection. We're going to have disruptive selection, directional selection, and stabilizing selection. All right? So our first example here, and what we want to kind of focus on initially for all these examples, is this bell-shaped curve. And so for these first couple examples, we're going to use kind of a made-up example of a situation where we have birds, kind of like those medium ground finches in the Galapagos, where if you were to go out and measure the beak sizes of all the birds in the population, you would find a few birds that had really tiny beaks, and a few birds that had really big beaks, and a whole lot of birds somewhere in the middle that have more or less an intermediate or middle-sized beak. Okay, so that's kind of my starting point examples, the bell-shaped curve. Now, with disruptive selection, what's going to happen is that the birds in the middle of this curve, the birds that have the medium-sized beaks, are going to be selected against. Maybe the specialist small-beaked birds do better on small seeds. They far outcompete the medium-beaked birds. And the same thing out here. The large-beaked birds, because they're more specialized, can easily outcompete the medium-beaked birds. So what eventually happens is the birds in the middle are selected against, and the birds at the two extremes, the small-beaked and large-beaked specialists, are selected for. And so in that case, we actually start seeing fewer and fewer and fewer of the birds that have those middle-sized beaks. And so eventually what could happen is if this becomes extreme enough, if this drop in the middle goes down far enough, you could actually have a split of this one species into two separate species. One species with a big beak, the other one with a small beak, and nothing in the middle, so they actually don't overlap anymore. And in that case, you actually have a speciation event occurring. Now, another situation that could occur is called... actually, let's go back a second and talk about this. There's an expression that says, a jack of all trades is a master of none. And that's really what we're talking about there with that previous example of the beak sizes in those birds. The birds that are able to eat all the seeds, the generalist species, or generalist individuals, not species, the generalist individuals are able to eat any size seed in the population, but they're not able to compete as effectively for either big seeds or small seeds compared to the large beaked specialist and the small beaked specialists. So sometimes being a generalist is not always the best thing. Sometimes being a specialist is more advantageous than being a generalist, and that's the case with that last example. All right, so moving on to directional selection. Now in this case, in this scenario, we're going to have a selective pressure which causes these small-beaked birds to be selected against and the large-beaked birds to be favored. All right, so in this case, this example, and then we'll talk about another one as well, we're going to see a shift in this curve to the right because now we have more large-beaked birds and fewer small-beaked birds. The curve goes from being the red dotted line to this black line with the kind of tan shading underneath. The curve is shifted to the right because now the average beak size has gotten bigger in that case. Maybe it's a really extreme drought where only the really big seeded plants are able to survive and reproduce. So only the really big beaked birds are able to survive and reproduce as well. There was another famous study that was done on fruit flies. I see a lot of studies done on fruit flies because they reproduce quickly and they have short lifespans, and we just know a lot about them. But they actually took these fruit flies with the genus name of Drosophila. You're going to see that name used a lot in your biology classes, Drosophila. Were artificially selected for their tendency to move toward light. Now, Fruit flies normally like kind of dark, damp places where they can find rotting vegetation and food to eat. But some fruit flies naturally have a more inherent preference for light. So these researchers took the flies that had the greatest preference for light. They bred those together over and over and over again. They made many generations of sort of light-loving fruit flies. And over time, they created a new type of fruit flies that actually liked being out in the open, out in the light. So that's kind of what this was. If you imagine this curve as being, percent time you spend in the light versus percent time spent in the dark, or just percent time spent in the light altogether. So if you went from 0 to 100, like 100% of the time you're in the light, 0% of the time you're in the dark, and then kind of the gradient in between, by artificially selecting for the flies that like being out in the open, you shift the curve more toward the right, and you create this new strain of light-loving fruit flies, which, again, that artificial selection is actually in sort of direct conflict with what natural selection says, because when you take away the artificial selective pressure, you go from having flies that like being out in the open very quickly back down to having that population prefer being in the dark, because they actually do better when they're in the dark. They don't dry out as quickly, they find more food, they're more protected, they're not going to be as easily preyed upon by other things. They just do better when they're in the dark. So once you take away the researchers making them breed in a certain way, they actually revert back to their original dark-loving ability within the span of maybe 20 generations. They actually go back to where they were before, pretty quickly, actually. The last example we're going to talk about, this one's actually a human example, evolutionary example in humans. So in this case, we're going to have both extremes removed from the population, or at least decreased in abundance in the population. And we're going to favor those that are in the middle. So we're going to take our bell-shaped curve that's relatively broad, and we're going to make it skinnier by taking out the really extreme outliers here in the population. Okay? So now in this case, I mentioned before, we're talking about humans. The human example we're talking about here is in birth weight. All right, so if we look at, first off, let's just ignore the red line. Look at the tan area in this graph. It's a bell-shaped curve, right? But the reason why this is a bell-shaped curve that's relatively sort of sharp and then it drops off again is that babies that are born down here in the 2 to 3 pound range and babies born out in like the 10 to 11 pound range don't have the highest survival. Right? Really tiny babies aren't well developed. They're not strong enough. They don't have a lot of energy reserves, and so they're more prone to succumbing to dangers in the environment. They don't survive as well. And really big babies, even though they might be strong and healthy otherwise, if they have a hard time through labor and delivery, then they might actually be less common in the population as well. So what we've seen over time is that in human infants, there is this kind of sweet spot between about 5 to 8 pounds or so where most of the babies in our species are born, because that is the range where you produce a big enough baby to be healthy, but not so big that it actually causes trauma or possible death or complications for mom and baby during labor and delivery. Okay? Now, the other thing to think about here is mortality. And the mortality line is the red line on this graph. And we see why the tan area is the way that it is, because out here in the 2 to 3 pound range, percent mortality is really high, relatively speaking, for babies that are that small. And the same thing out here, 10 pounds and beyond, the mortality rate for those babies is pretty big as well. So the spot where we see the lowest mortality is the spot where we're going to see the highest percent in the population for birth weights. Another thing to think about here is, okay, well, what would happen if we sort of account for the incidence of C-sections in the population? So what happens if those bigger 10 or 11 pound babies aren't so strongly selected against because of the labor and delivery process? If they're born surgically as opposed to naturally, then all of a sudden this percent mortality drops, and this curve actually shifts to the right a little bit. Because remember, bigger babies are stronger and healthier. If we can get them born safely without those complications, in that case, we'd actually have a directional selection toward the right, and the average birth weight in babies would actually get bigger, which is exactly what happened after C-sections first became sort of popular, is that the average birth weight in humans has actually increased over the past couple hundred years. All right, so what we're going to do is we're going to stop here. We're going to pick up with one more short section in this chapter. It'll be our 5th section in this chapter, and we'll wrap up pretty quickly after that.